So I'm Kip Cherry from Central, and with me is Joanne Pinone. If you'll wave Joanne, she's the chair of our group. Thanks for coming and welcome. Tonight's lecture is entitled Saving the Joseph Bonaparte Estate, presented by Linda Meade, President and CEO of the DNR Greenway, and Pat Coleman, Chairman of the Board of Friends of Abbott Marshlands. As you think of questions through the presentation, please put your questions in the chat, and then we will try to retrieve them during questions and answers. I'm sure you'll have a lot of questions. I already do myself. Before I start, let me just say that the DNR Greenway specializes in land preservation and has preserved and permanently protected over 21,000 acres at 315 properties. Friends of the Abbott Marshlands are focused on the Lenape and their presence along the Delaware in the neighborhood of Point Breeze. The Friends have worked with a consultant to develop a curriculum on the Lenape. Now, to zero in on the property that was acquired, Point Breeze was the estate of Joseph Bonaparte, Napoleon Bonaparte's eldest brother. Joseph Bonaparte was the king of Naples from 1806 to 1808, and then the king of Spain from 1808 to 1813. After Napoleon was defeated in 1815 at the Battle of Waterloo and sent into exile, Joseph Bonaparte fled to the United States. Built in 1816, his mansion was the largest residence in the United States at the time. Replaced after a fire, Bonaparte continued to live on the estate until 1838. There's several tunnels in part of the estate, and one of the tunnels is connected from the mansion, between the mansion and Crosswicks Creek, which allowed people to come and go undetected, probably including a variety of French political refugees who were Bonaparte supporters. This area was almost lost to a large warehouse development. A land acquisition team led by Linda, with some great help from others, saved the property. You'll be hearing much more about that. Linda has led the DNR Greenway since 1997. She is adept at fundraising and structuring complex land preservation transactions. Now I'm turning over the podium to Linda.
It's good to see a lot of friends here. I see a lot of people I know and some new people, and that's fabulous because we really want to spread the word far and wide about the work that DNR Greenway is doing, and especially here in Bordentown. And I'm really pleased that Pat Coleman could join me to present tonight. So I'm going to tell you some stories about how the land was preserved and really focus more on the land preservation story. And then I'll introduce Pat to talk about the Native Americans along the Delaware. So I'm going to share my screen. So let me talk to you a little bit about the magic of land preservation. That's what Kip called it when she talked to me about this program. And I love that term because it really is, it feels like magic when you put these land preservation deals together. And you think about, as you go into it, a variety of things, such as, why do we do it? Why are we going to do this in the first place? And then comes the difficult how. How do we make it happen? And that's where the fundraising and the skill and the know-how come in. And then we say to ourselves, well, why does it really matter? How does it work and why does it matter? So I'm going to address all those things. And as I talk about land preservation, keep in mind that every land preservation deal is different. I've personally been involved in probably 300 land preservation transactions, first in Pennsylvania for about 10 years and for the last 24 years in New Jersey. And I know I don't look that old, but yes, I have. So I've been over 30 years in land preservation. And it is true what they say, that it doesn't matter if it's a 0.2 of an acre parcel, which we have preserved in Bordentown down at Lime Kiln Alley Park, or if it's a property that's 2,000 acres, which DNR Greenway has preserved, working in South Jersey in the Mannington Meadows area, and also with Princeton Nurseries out in Allentown area. And it doesn't matter what size the property is, because all the different pieces have to be done to get from start to finish. And they all take time, money, know-how. So we'll address that. And in the process of addressing that, I'll touch on some of the key features of Point Breeze and some of the ways that I think this particular transaction came together that are critical to all transactions. So with that in mind, let me start with the why. Why do we care? Why did we work on preserving Point Breeze? DNR Greenway is a land trust that's been around since 1989. And when we were founded to preserve lands along the Delaware and Raritan Canal and the tributaries that flow into it. And that by definition means the Delaware River watershed as well. And so the fact that this land, this particular piece of land at Point Breeze is on the Delaware River and the Crosswicks Creek that flows into it makes it a very important parcel of land to us. You know, it starts out with the importance of protecting clean water. And it also is a place of great history. These messages you see up here are messages that one of our young fellows created last year that were up on the marquee in front of the Trenton Thunder Stadium. And we did a series of them there to raise awareness about the Delaware River and about protecting the important components of the Delaware River. And so that was the first thing we took a look at, was the waterways and the history and the heritage associated with this property. It's also directly a part of the Abbott Marshlands, and Pat's going to tell you more about that. But the Abbott Marshlands is a project that DNR Greenway has worked on for 25 plus years. And you know, this is a very critical area. It used to be seen in historical contexts as the Trenton Marshes or the Hamilton-Trenton Marshes. And as it became the Hamilton-Trenton Bordentown Marshes, there was a consortium, a partnership that came together and put the name Abbott Marshlands on that. And it's a very important ecological area. And this land in Bordentown sits at the southern terminus of the Abbott Marshlands. And the history of this property is so significant that it received a lot of international attention when we preserved it. And you can see here, here's the first mansion of Joseph Bonaparte sitting on the bluffs in Bordentown here above the Crosswicks Creek coming down into the Delaware River. And, you know, even today, it continues to be a very important area for recreation along the waterways, and a very important area for history. When it was preserved, it was indeed featured in the Times of London, on the Spanish news service, for all the reasons that Bonaparte was here. So it's a significant land transaction. It also, as you look at this, I've been fascinated to learn about some of the Bonaparte history, and I'm not going to go into that in great detail. I've worked with the Bordentown Historical Society, some of whom the folks are here today, and they have an incredible collection of Bonaparte materials. These are some of the photographs and the pieces, such as this card from the 250th anniversary to admit people to Bonaparte Park on this property. So this incredible history, and working with the Bordentown Historical Society to share that will be a part of the future of this property. And as Kip mentioned, yes, there are tunnels that are on the property. This happens to be reminiscent of the tunnels that Bonaparte had, but it also is a part of a rock grotto that was built by Harris Hammond, one of the subsequent owners on the property. And this is on the surface of the land. It's still there. It's not underground. And you can walk here and get this incredible view out to the actually Crosswicks Creek in the Abbott Marshlands. And on the right, this came from a tour we took on the property, where we set up some of the books that have talked about Joseph Bonaparte being here, and Charles Lucien Bonaparte, his nephew, who was an ornithologist who lived here. And you know, this area is very important as a migratory bird corridor. And in fact, John James Audubon visited and was on the property at Point Breeze when he was young, and I'm told sketching birds from along the Delaware River. So, you know, how do we do this and what makes it work? And I put this in here because I wanted to say that I think the most important factor when you go into any land preservation transaction or negotiation, I should say, is really who the people are and what types of relationships you have. So in the case of Abbott Marshlands, as I said, we've been working here for over 25 years. And this is a photo here of former Mayor Jim Lynch and Joel Dalshin, who sits on the Abbott Marshlands Council, both people who are very rooted in Bordentown, grew up there, and very active in the community. And working with them is something that was a critical component, and particularly former Mayor Lynch, who I'll speak more about, who was critical to making this happen. But these relationships we've had over many years is what made this work. Mayor Lynch, I'm going to tell you a story in a minute, was really, I think, the critical person in the end who made this deal happen, because he came up with the solution to a challenge that we had. And he and I first met over 25 years ago when we were working together on the Delaware River sojourn. So, you know, one thing leads to another, and down the road, we come to preserving the Point Breeze property. Green Acres, this is Martha Sapp, who's the director of the program. And Green Acres, as you all know, I believe, has public funding available in New Jersey to preserve land. And the state had preserved land along the bluffs. DNR Greenway was part of that 25 plus years ago. And so Green Acres was very interested from the beginning. And that relationship they had with the property and the relationship that they had with DNR Greenway, having worked on 300 plus properties that we've preserved together, is what helped to make this transaction happen. And here's the challenge. I want to tell you a little bit about this. This is Park Street coming from 206, headed down into Bordentown, called the New York Turnpike some time ago. And the gardener's house that you see in the front is closest to Park Street. And that is the structure that DNR Greenway now owns, that we are converting and renovating into a museum and discovery center about this area and about this property. On the property on this map, you're going to see here's the Crosswicks Creek coming down, flowing into the Delaware River. This is an area that was dammed by Joseph Bonaparte to create a lake in this area. And you even see the lake house, and the lake house is where his nephew, Charles Lucien Bonaparte, lived and hosted John James Audubon. This is the first mansion that you saw in the other slide that was on the property, no longer there. This is the Hammond Rock Garden or Rock Grotto with the tunnel that I referred to. And here's the second Bonaparte mansion. I'm not going to go into these details tonight. And then finally, a third mansion that was built by Beckett at one time when he owned the property, an Englishman who bought it after Joseph Bonaparte's time. And that is no longer standing, though it was used by Divine Word missionaries for a time. What's important on this map that I want to show you is 1, 2, 3 tan blocks here. So what these are the buildings, the more modern buildings that were built in the 1950s, 1960s by Divine Word missionaries who owned the property for 80 years. And we purchased the property from Divine Word missionaries. So I have to say that we had a long relationship with Divine Word through the Abbott Marshlands, through Dr. Mary Leck, who worked with them on having them host several conferences there. And so DNR Greenway knew Divine Word missionaries. Mayor Lynch knew Divine Word missionaries, priests very well. And the state also had dealings on the bluffs with Divine Word missionaries. So that relationship was there from all three parties that were party to this preservation, the state, the city, DNR Greenway. And as we were preserving this land, the challenge that came forward is what happens to the buildings. So when you think about it, when you're preserving land, oftentimes we're preserving it to become a preserve, a park, which is open land with recreational facilities, passive recreation. And the challenge always comes when there's buildings on the property, because that's a challenge in terms of funding, in terms of managing those buildings. What are they going to become? So I want to go back for a minute, because as we were sitting and thinking about how do we make this happen, I think that the passion that Mayor Lynch had for this property is what really came into play. He had been getting calls, I had been getting calls for quite some time. As soon as we learned this property was going to be put up for sale, we were getting calls from developers, and they would call him and they would call me and they would say, we'll make sure you get something out of this, but we want to develop this property. Now, there were warehouse developers that wanted to put 3 warehouses on the property. There were residential developers that wanted to put housing all over the property. There were developers that you might think of as more friendly that wanted to do some renovations to the buildings, maybe create some educational space or create some office space. But at the same time, none of that is what our vision, really fit our vision for this property. And Mayor Lynch, who would get a lot of these calls and would hear a lot about the kind of money that was being offered to Divine Word missionaries, really came up with a solution to the buildings. Because, you know, if we couldn't deal with the buildings, we couldn't buy the property. And so I remember very clearly sitting in a meeting at the old City Hall, and the old City Hall is in an old historic building in downtown Bordentown, and there's literally not a room left for any file cabinets or file space. It's cramped. And we were sitting in the one upstairs conference room around a table with representatives from the state, from DNR Greenway, and from the city. And Mayor Lynch said, you know, I think we could move our city administration building to the Divine Word property. And that changed everything. I knew as soon as he said it, it changed everything, because now we knew we had a good use for those buildings. They didn't need to be demolished at a great cost and create a lot of waste that needed to be disposed of. They were buildings that could be reused, turned into a good use for the city, and bring people to the property where they could learn about its history and its ecological value. And so that, to me, was the critical moment. And I think any land preservation transaction anybody is working in, you need to have somebody locally who's the champion for that. You need the local government involved, and they need to be the champion. At the same time, Green Acres was critical, because Green Acres, you know, had the big dollars to bring to the table. And fortunately, they had the relationship that they were committed to this even during the pandemic. This all happened in the first year of the pandemic. And so people were working remotely from home, and we would have to get together on Zoom calls and telephone calls and figure out how to make all this happen. Meanwhile, we were negotiating with Divine Word missionaries. And so here's the exciting thing. In 30 years, I have never had to wait for the compensation from Rome to say, we are going to sign this contract and preserve this land. But at 11:50 on October 9th, and I have that in my emails, we received word from Rome, because Divine Word missionaries is a separate missionary, but in Rome, they have their main operating council that had to approve this. So the contract we negotiated went to Rome. It was approved on October 9th. And then we got together and we inked the contract. We signed it on October 12th, just a few days later, masks on, socially distanced. And on October 18th, literally 2 months later, we closed on the preservation of the property. That was really record speed. And it was because all these things happened ahead of time during the pandemic, with all of us working closely together to put everything in place to get to the closing. So before I run out of time, I'll just mention a couple more things. Back to people. This is Peter Tucci, who is a collector of Bonaparte artifacts, has the biggest collection in the world of Joseph Bonaparte artifacts. And he will be displaying those in the new Gardener's House Museum that will be created. Over here, I want to say, you know, here's Father Padovani from Divine Word. And up here is Chief Mann from the Lenni Lenape, who all these folks participated in our gala, DNR Greenway's gala, when we gave our annual conservation award to former Mayor Lynch last year. Whoops, let me go back. And the reason I wanted to point out these two together is there is a component of thought, stewardship thought, that I think of when I think of Native Americans who lived hand in hand with nature and knew how to live with nature in a way that didn't diminish the resources. And that philosophy of caring for nature and having that ethical or moral responsibility to do so is something that was really carried forward through the years. And Father Padovani, in a video that's on DNR Greenway's website, talks about how the moral responsibility of Divine Word missionaries was to ensure that this land would come back to the people of New Jersey. And it's that stewardship component, it's that thought, it's that philosophy of feeling connected to the land and caring for the land that is so important in most land transactions that are done. Economics are important, the bottom line's important, but the bottom line does include that passion for the land. And so finally, why do we care about all this? Why did we go to all this trouble and raise the money and put all this together and the partnerships and take this time to preserve it? I talked about that in the beginning, but as we come toward the end of my remarks, this is an archaeological dig that we did this fall, just a little bit of discovery. And the heritage and the history of this property is the main reason that we did all this, along with the Delaware River. Here's some things you'll see in the house when you come and visit. This is an oven that goes back to the time of Bonaparte. We did the research to see that this was an oven that was created by Tasker Morris, which was an iron firm that created ovens and later the first fire hydrants. And it was in Philadelphia. And they created ovens such as this around the time that Bonaparte was there. And you can see that as we started to do some renovation inside the house, we found some really interesting things underneath some of the sheetrock walls. And so we found this really interesting artistic possibly painted on paper and then applied to the walls like a border on the wall. Really interesting, and you'll see that. Really an important part of this is the ecology. The ecology that I've talked about with the bird migratory corridors, the natural resources, the plants that are found on this property. We're doing a natural resource inventory right now in partnership with Conserve Wildlife of New Jersey. And our vision is to recreate some of the gardens that were there. And when we recreate those gardens, we want to do it in a way that gives back to the community that cares about this property. This goes back to the spring. And one of the first things we did is we worked with Senator Singleton and 25 volunteers and some of their friends from the Bordentown Historic Society. And we did some landscaping and we started to put together a little bit of a garden up against the house here where we took out forsythia bushes. But this spring we're planning to have the first of the gardens go in, and we are looking forward to growing food that we can then give back and produce just like we do at our St. Michael's Farm Preserve, and give back to the community and donate that food to people in need. We're looking for volunteers, by the way, to help us with that. This is Assemblywoman Carol Murphy, who came out to the property early on. And again, people, relationships, very important. So we did this for education and discovery. This new museum or discovery center will come this summer. We'll talk about 13,000 years of history. And we are looking for volunteers to work in the garden as docents and to help us steward the land. And donations are always welcome. You know, we've been raising all this money privately to do this work. So we invite you to participate with us. And coming back to where I started, the Delaware River, why do we do this? We do this for clean water. Think about those warehouses and the runoff that would have gone into the Crosswicks Creek and the Delaware River. And now it's going to stay clean because we were able to preserve this property. So this is a beautiful photograph, thanks to Susan Van Dongen from Bordentown, of the area just at Bordentown Beach, looking out to the Delaware River. Finally, I want to end my remarks by introducing Pat Coleman. And as I do that, I want to say, you know, why do we do it? You know, we save land from development. So look at this photo. This is that first this is the Divine Word buildings that are now going to be the city administration building. But this is where that Divine Word mansion was, right up here on the bluffs. I'm sorry, the Bonaparte mansion was right up here on the bluffs. And this is the Crosswicks Creek coming down toward the Delaware River. You're looking across right here. This is the railroad line. If you went underneath that, you come out to the Delaware River and the Bordentown Beach. Here's the Delaware and Raritan Canal. And what I want to point out is, here's development. Look at all this development. Look at all this development. And here's the property that we saved. And you know what all this is? This is the Abbott Marshlands. And so this contiguousness of all these lands working together is what keeps this area an important ecological resource. And so with that, I want to introduce Pat Coleman. I'll stop sharing my screen, and I've had the pleasure of working with her as the on the Abbott Marshlands Council and with the Friends for the Abbott Marshlands. And she's going to tell us about the marshlands and the Lenape that lived in this area, and then we'll take questions. So thank you.
Thank you, Linda. That was great. That was really interesting. I would like to begin my portion of the presentation with a land acknowledgement statement, recognizing that we are situated in Lenapehoking, the traditional and ancestral homeland of the Lenape. We pay respect to the Lenape, past, present, and future, and to their continuing cultural heritage and connection with this homeland. So the Abbott Marshlands are one of the most significant Lenape heritage sites in the region, and they have attracted human populations for up to 13,000 years. My involvement in learning about the Lenape came as part of a collaboration with the Tulpahacking Nature Center. As we interpret the Abbott Marshlands, we wanted to make sure that we could do it in a way that respected the Lenape heritage. And so we began to work together with a series of advisors to develop a series of educational programs, primarily aimed for children, but we learned a lot in the process. So one of the things that's really important is to recognize that the Lenape are still with us today, and they are with us in many different capacities. There are federally recognized tribes in the US. There are Canadian First Nation tribes. There are 3 different recognized tribes in state recognized tribes in New Jersey, and many other states also have descendant communities that may not be officially recognized, but that does not mean that they're not Lenape heritage and they're not Lenape people. And one of the reasons for this complexity is really looking at where were the Lenape located. Well, here we have the Abbott Marshlands on the left, right in the center of Lenapehoking. And you can see the Abbott Marshlands is kind of central, and that the Lenape occupied some of the first lands that were heavily occupied by European settlers in this country. So when the settlers began moving heavily into the area of the Abbott marshlands, there were pressures on people. Some people did not want to deal with the pressure of these folks coming in and buying the land. And they moved off to the Susquehanna Valley in Pennsylvania and thought that they would be safe. And as we all know, it didn't last long before the settlers were moving further west, and then they had to move to Ohio. And as you can see in this map, we're not going to take time with it, but there were many, many moves that the Lenape, Delaware people had to make because they were one of the first people to be contacted. And as a result, they were people whose culture was disrupted over and over and over again. So here's a picture of the Abbott marshlands from Google Earth. All the way down, I don't know if you can see my pointer, but all the way down in this corner is the Point Breeze estate that Linda's been talking about. This gives you a great sense of this oasis of green in an otherwise heavily urban environment. And the Delaware River, of course, I cut it out, but it's right down here along the left. And one of the things that's important to remember about this is, as you saw in some of Linda's pictures, there is this bluff which extends all around the edge of the marshlands. And it goes all the way up around the Crosswicks Creek on both sides of the Crosswick and all the way out to Trenton. If you've ever seen the Riverview Cemetery from Route 29, that's kind of the edge of the bluff. Because of that bluff next to the marshlands, you've got a real diversity of habitats. You've got freshwater wetlands, rivers, creeks, swamps, marshes, ponds, natural springs, all close together and nearby with floodplain forests and upland bluffs and forests. And what that does for you is give you a tremendous diversity of plant and animal life. These numbers are what we have today. I could not begin to imagine what the numbers must have been like at the time that the Lenape were coming into the area. So why is it called the Abbott marshlands? Well, this is Charles Conrad Abbott, and he was what I would call a gentleman scholar. He was actually trained as an MD, but he was a naturalist. He was an amateur scientist, and he grew up wandering the bluffs. He eventually bought a farm there. And as he wandered the land and observed animal life, he started finding artifacts. And if you've visited the State Museum in New Jersey and Trenton, Abbott's artifacts are all over the place there. And what he believed is that he found evidence that Stone Age man lived in New Jersey. So if you think about it, in 1872, he put forth this theory, which is at the same time that in Europe, people are considering the theory of Neanderthal man and living before the glaciers. And Abbott thought he had evidence of this. So scholars from the US and Europe flocked to visit the Abbott Farm area. The Abbott Farm itself is just a little bit north of Point Breeze, maybe a mile at most, but still within the marshlands. So you had scholars from all over the place coming and studying the archaeology, studying the geology. And there was an active controversy for 25 years trying to understand how long man had been in this place. In the end, it turns out that Abbott's antiquity claim was disproven because no, there was no man here 40,000 years ago, but there were people here 13,000 years ago. This is Dorothy Cross, who the archaeological explorations that started with Abbott continued, And in the 30s, a WP excavation was held in the marshlands, where many sites were excavated and a tremendous amount of information was added to the repertoire. This is a timeline, and it gives you a sense that there is a real deep history in this place. Now, back at the time of the Paleo Indians, we are talking about small groups of people that were very mobile and would move around from time to time. And as time went on, the groups became larger. There were some semi-sedentary populations. They might stay for certain seasons of the year. But by the time you get into this middle woodland period, we really do have a change and some much larger populations staying here for a much longer time. There's a lot of archaeological evidence of large gatherings for fishing. So one of the things that the Delaware River brings to us is anadromous fish. These are fish that spend part of their life cycle out in the ocean, and then they come back up the river to spawn. They come at large numbers, in large numbers. So it's a great time for people to get together and to cooperate, because they can catch large volumes of fish. Now, they didn't fish with hooks, they fished with nets. This is a drawing by John Kraft about what a fishing setup might look like. And you see that there would be fires and racks for drying, and it was an important economic activity that brought people together to work in large groups, because they could catch and dry and preserve enormous quantities. Over here on the right, you see some of the archaeological evidence. These are actually little net sinker weights. So they're just little stones that have notches at either end, and they would have been used to hold the fishing nets. This is another example from that middle woodland period of something called Abbott zoned pottery. So it's during this time that pottery became really dominant in the marsh. Of course, the marsh supplied lots of natural clays as the raw material for the pottery. And this particular type of pottery is really very elaborately decorated for its time. And the designs on it often mirror designs that are representative of places in the marsh. This particular design is thought to be of a weir net, of a fishing weir that was built. And this is distinctive. This particular design on the pottery is distinctive of the Abbott marshlands, and is expected to be something that really does demonstrate the fact that people came here from all over the Lenape-Hoking area. You do occasionally find pieces of this pottery in other places, but it's pretty unusual. And that is it, 10 minutes. So that was a very quick presentation to just give you a brief overview of what's here. There's a lot of stories to tell, and it could go on for hours, but I am glad because you came. And here's just a couple pictures of views in the Abbott marshlands.
Thank you very much, Pat and Linda. We have a few questions in the chat. The first question is for Linda, and it just moved on me, but it related to whether there are any buildings that have been have no longer existence that we know of that were on the property before. And I guess Linda did touch on that. Do we know where it says, are there any historic structures that have been lost, i.e. existed at some point, but you don't know where they are now?
For the most part, we know where they were. And yes, the first and second mansions of Joseph Bonaparte burned down. The first one, you may have heard the story where Joseph Bonaparte had built his first mansion. He had an extensive world-class collection, bigger than anywhere else in the US, of European art and books in his mansion. He was away from the property, and the property caught on fire, and that mansion did burn down. And of course, this was before we had fire trucks to come out and help. So people from town saw the smoke and came and collected a lot of the art and the books that were there and saved those. And when Joseph came back to the property, they actually brought them and presented them back to him. And he was so enamored of the fact that these people were kind enough and thoughtful enough. They didn't just go running off with the goods. They basically brought them back, gave them to him. And he said, I want to settle here. I want to continue to be here because this is a good and kind community. And he wrote a wonderful letter that was published in the newspaper. And we'll have a copy of that in the Gardener's House Museum when you come and visit, so that you can see how Joseph felt about the community. So that burnt down. He built a second mansion that burnt down. There was Henry Beckett, who came and built a mansion, which was used by Divine Word missionaries when they first came to the property 80 years ago. That unfortunately burnt down. And so there were a number of, the lake house is gone. There were a number of places that are gone. But we have good maps, historic maps and photographs that show where those were and what those look like, for the most part. There are still the remnants of some tunnels. There's still the remnants of some of these structures. When we did the archaeological dig right around within the 1 acre that DNR Greenway owns, around the Gardener's House, and we did this last fall, we did find underground some remnants of what looks like some type of shed or structure that would have been behind the Gardener's House. And Dr. Richard Veit from Monmouth University is doing that work and will be working with us to try to figure out what this is. So I would just like to say, and I'm sure that everybody in the Sierra Club is very respectful of these kinds of things, but remember that it's very important to protect these artifacts. So we certainly don't want people coming and digging up any artifacts, but you can certainly walk around the property and see what is there.
Right. Okay, here's another question. And I don't know whether you want to reveal everything, but question is, how much money did the property sell for? And how did it compare to what the larger commercial developers were willing to offer? How did the mayor sell? How did the mayor sell? The second part. How did the mayor sell this transaction to his residents, who may have been less interested than he was in the project and more concerned about?
Okay, so let me answer the. Let's see. I think I can answer the first part. I'm trying to remember back the exact amount that we paid for the property. I think it was 4.6 million. There was a little negotiation. It was going up and down between 4.5. I think in the end, it ended up being 4.6 million. And that was the way that the mayor sold that, was that each of us put an amount of money in. The state put the biggest amount of money in, which was over $2 million, $2.5 million. The city put in, I believe it was less than 2, and DNR Greenway essentially purchased the Gardener's House itself on 1 acre for $260,000. So we had the smallest component, obviously, but the fact that everybody put money into the pot together is what made this work. The state came in with the biggest amount of money, and the agreement was that the state would put the funds into preservation, but was looking to the city and DNR Greenway to manage the property. So we agreed to do that, which got it past that challenge of who's going to take care of it into the future.
Okay, well, and how many acres? I think it was a much smaller property at the beginning, and then Bonaparte acquired more property.
He acquired a lot of property over time, and I don't recall what the exact amount was at the highest amount, but it was hundreds and hundreds of acres. And a lot of that was sold off over time and disappeared. And back in the early 1990s, DNR Greenway and the state of New Jersey, who took the lead, purchased land along the bluffs. So what was left today that we just purchased was 60 acres. So it's the 60 core acres that have the open fields. There's some ball fields that were already existing, and the woods and the bluffs along the Crosswicks Creek.
So let me throw in one of my questions, and that is that Bonaparte is known for having this huge library. Do we have any idea why he had so many books? Why was he interested in books?
I can't answer that question. I just know that it was the largest collection in the US at the time, and that Peter Tucci, the collector, has some of those books that he has acquired that belong to Joseph Bonaparte. And we plan to showcase some of those under glass at the new museum when it opens.
Okay. When is the property open? Days, hours? And thank you for all the great work you're doing.
Oh, thank you. So it is currently open. When it was purchased with using state public funds, it officially is open to the public. You can go there. You can take a walk around. I know of someone who goes and takes his bike and rides some of the pathways. And so you can do that pretty much anytime dawn to dusk. There's not a lot of resources there as a park just yet. We're in the planning stage. So we're in the process of planning the signage and the kiosks and the benches and so on that'll all become a part of the park. But you are welcome. There's parking areas there. If you drive in the main drive, you drive in at the Divine Word Missionary sign on Park Street, drive all the way back the drive, and you'll see a big parking lot. You can park there and you can take a walk around.
Linda, this is Jim Lynch. Should I comment on the
Oh,
city's
hi,
portion?
Jim. I didn't know you were here. Fantastic. I was singing your praises. Please comment.
No, thank you. I can comment on the question of the taxpayer in the city and how we went about raising the funds for this. We paid 1.655 for our portion. And our intention is to sell City Hall on Main Street. And we feel that that property is probably going to bring between $400,000 and $500,000. So that's going to relieve that debt. But we also had debt being relieved on bonds over the years, which we have a revolving debt service that we have when we buy our fire trucks or garbage trucks and things of that sort. So as we did the math with this project, we felt that basically it wasn't going to cost the taxpayers any increase in taxes because of the debt being retired in the future and the sale of the property on Farnsworth Avenue, which we would turn that into a rateable. So all the math worked out. This is pretty much like a perfect storm with Linda's leadership with DNR Greenway and her cohorts and Peter Tucci and those folks, and then the state of New Jersey coming in. I know I saw a check for $10 million that the fathers turned down because they were sincere in what Father Padavani had said, that he wanted to they wanted to return that property to the people of New Jersey, in particular the city of Bordentown. So that's a big thing. Nobody turns down a check for $10 million these days for anything, but you heard it from the fathers, they did. So for 4.6, that did the deal. And then on top of that, with the museum going on top of the memorandum of management, we feel we can manage the property in the city. Our police department will be there as far as the rangers go. We don't need rangers there. And it was just a perfect storm where all this came together. It's once in a lifetime opportunity. And if we didn't have the partners with Linda and DNR Greenway in the state, this would have been really something that probably could have been some, and I'm only touching base on a couple of the things that could have been. There were even worse proposals in there that I can't even talk about. So kudos to everybody. Everybody did a great job, including my colleagues on the commission, our deputy mayor, Bernowski, and Commissioner Myers at the time. Everybody stepped up.
Yeah, thank you, Jim, for saying
Any
that.
questions, let me know. I'm going to put myself back on mute.
That's a terrific story. That's great. So.
Can I just say, if anybody would like to hear more about this, you can go to DNR Greenway's website, drgreenway.org, and you'll see a video, Preserving Point Breeze. So you can click on that video and you can hear a whole lot more of the background and see more of the property. So I invite you to do that.
Okay, great. And then, well, let me ask you, Mr. Tucci had been, I guess, a long-term collector of Bonaparte memorabilia. What was his influence over the project?
He was very instrumental in initially coming in and talking with us about the opportunity. Everything kind of converged at once because Peter was very involved in kind of following what was going on in Bordentown with this property for many years and became aware of the fact that the priests were going to be selling the property. Around the same time, we got a call from Father Poole, and around the same time, former Mayor Lynch went in and met with Father Poole. So we all were getting they were reaching out to us and letting us know that this was something that was going to happen. So he was very influential in that. He also made the offer to DNR Greenway to showcase the artifacts that he had in the house, because again, the challenge is always buildings, and the city took care of the Divine Word buildings, and DNR Greenway agreed to take care of renovating and creating a center in the gardener's house. And so we needed a partner or partners that would help us showcase the history of the property. And Peter came in with that offer to us.
Okay, great.
Kip, before you go on, June has her hand up. I think she has a question.
Oh, is there a hand up?
Yep. June, would you like to ask your question?
I'm just looking at the chat. I'm not seeing the hand up yet.
I have a question. I was trying to type it in. How did the Divine group get a hold of the land?
The property had actually been through several subsequent owners after Joseph Bonaparte. And I believe the last one was Harris Hammond, who owned the property for a period of time and then went bankrupt, and the property was taken over by the bank. And after several years in bankruptcy, it was then purchased by Divine Word missionaries. And they were looking for a place where they could have a seminary to bring priests. And for many years, it was actually used as an educational seminary. And there were many, many priests who came to programs there. There's big dorm buildings there that you can see, where they came from all over the world, and a lot of third world countries. And very interestingly, I think the first African-American priest that was ordained came to Divine Word missionaries at this site as part of that program.
Okay, we have a question about what happened to Bonaparte when he, Joseph Bonaparte, when he left America. Where did he go before he died? Do we know?
So he did leave and he went back to France, and he died there. And again, I'm not the history experts. There are others here that are, so I don't want to get into some of the details for fear of saying something wrong, but he went back to France and he reunited with his wife, who had stayed there over the years. She did not come to Point Breeze. And there's many stories about that. In fact, one of the interesting stories is that during this process of all the publicity that went out, we were contacted by someone who is a descendant of Joseph and a mistress that he had when he was living at Point Breeze. And she has just written a book after researching many stories about Joseph. So that will be another interesting component, I think, that will come forward through this museum.
That sounds great. I have a question for Pat. I noticed the time or the year 900 AD, and that was when there was a change in the kind of decoration on the pots. Do we know how far back the Marshland site dates?
So Dates are always somewhat controversial, but 13,000 years is a date that many archaeologists feel comfortable with in terms of how long ago there was habitation. So that would have been 11,000 BC. But as I said, in that time, it was small groups of people moving through.
Okay, we have a number of people who have just, thrown accolades at what you all have been doing. And so I'll just pass that along as a general thing. There's a question here about Green Acres and Fawn McGee. Oh, I guess that's informational as to who is in charge of Green Acres if somebody wants to contact them for funds.
Well, I can add, Kip, I mentioned how people
Okay.
worked during the pandemic and had such dedication to this project. And three of those people that I want to mention. So Fawn McGee, who's the head of the state acquisition program, and also Terry Caruso, who retired just as we were completing this and beginning to work on the management and use agreement. They both put tremendous amount of time in. Terry was a day-to-day person working on this. And then Renee Jones has since been working with us on the management and use agreement and other dedicated, long-time Green Acres employees. So thanks to all of them for everything that they've done.
Ronnie, go ahead. Do you have a question or comment?
Yes, I have a question. Have you considered asking someone from the Lenape community, wherever they happen to be living, have someone come to the museum to give lectures who you would pay, give a job to some, have people coming in from the Lenape tribe, and I would like to know, are any of the Lenape living anywhere to this day surrounding the Abbott grassland? But I think it would be wonderful if you reached out to the Lenape community wherever they're living in this country to see if you could bring in some of their speakers, their historians, so that people would come and firsthand be able to hear the history as it's traveled down through the Lenape tribe.
Thank you so much for that comment. We reached out to Chief Mann. I showed you his picture in my slideshow. And he is from the Lenape, the Ramapo Lenape, and he is creating a garden in northern New Jersey, the Muncie Garden. And he has offered to donate some seeds to us for the new garden that we will create at Point Breeze. And we're seeking his advice. We also have reached out to and work with the Arrows for Indians, which is another group with an executive director who is in Morrisville, Pennsylvania. So there still are some Lenape that live in this area. And one of the things that they have brought to my attention is that they would like to have a place like this, and they would love this to be the property where they might be able to have some Native American ceremonies. Because they don't have a place to come to for that in central New Jersey. So we're hoping to create a stronger partnership there. And I'm working with Pat Coleman from the Friends of the Abbott Marshlands on some of the exhibits. And Pat, I saw some great materials there that should be part of our exhibits. And so I think Pat will also be able to make some connections and help us make that happen.
I think
I would just add to that when we developed our educational programs, we sent drafts of all the materials to all of the federally recognized tribes, Canadian recognized tribes, state recognized tribes. So we have been trying to communicate everything that we're doing and get feedback from folks along the way, and also have made contacts with people about future talks.
Okay, great. And there's a comment in the chat, someone, I've lost the name, but says that he actually went to Italy and died there.
Thank you. And it might be Michael Skelly, who also said that, who's with the Bordentown Historical Society, who also said that it was over 1,200 acres that Bonaparte owned at one time. So thanks, Mike. If that was you, thank you.
That's great. Another question, and I asked this of you all just a little earlier, but I was very impressed with the notion that Bonaparte wanted to design the landscape around his home, that he had certain ideas about what he wanted to plant. And that's an idea that was very popular in the United States in the latter part of the 19th century, but certainly not in the 1800s. And I think you had an answer for me. Where did you get that idea of changing the landscape? Do you know?
We actually had a program at Point Breeze this past fall where we had Rebecca Flemmer, who has a degree in historic preservation and particularly in gardens, who came and gave a talk to us about the landscape and about gardens of that era. And it was very much a movement, and there were a number of things she spoke about as to how gardens were designed. And they were designed in such a way to invite people in, and particularly at this property, there were places, promenades where you looked out at the Delaware River, and gardens and the lake itself, where people from the community were invited in to participate and be part of that. So that's where a lot of that came from. And I see actually it was, besides Mike Skelly, it was also IMA Whitfield, who was a fellow with DNR Greenway this year, who reminded me that Joseph died in Italy. So thank you, IMA. IMA is working on many of the exhibits for the new museum. And I don't know whether to call it a museum or a discovery center, whatever it may be. It's a place where you'll come and you'll learn about the different moments in time. And I just want to say that I've thought a lot about land and land ownership and land stewardship over the last 30 years. And it's become more and more a part of my own philosophy. And I think it's just a truism. If you stand on a location and you close your eyes, you can think back into centuries ago. You can think all these different ownerships over time, and you look forward and you know there's going to be many more ownerships after you're gone. And so that one moment in time you're standing there is just a moment in time. And this continuum of ownership is something that's so important to the stewardship of the land, and it's about being good stewards. And we need every one of those owners to be good stewards of the land. And that's why for me, when I listen to Chief Mann talking about the Lenape, and when I listen to, I look at the Bonaparte Gardens, and then I listen to Father Padovani, who talks about the divine word philosophy of bringing this back to the people. To me, that's all this beautiful kind of stewardship continuum that came through the years and what we hope to take forward into the future.
Well, related to that, the Lenape, I believe they were forcibly moved out of the area. I think they went to Kansas. Is that right? Is that, Pat, is that where the Lenape ended up?
So the Lenape have ended up in many different places. As I mentioned, originally they just moved into central Pennsylvania. Then there was a large settlement of them in Ohio for a long time. Then there was a group that went to Kansas. Today, there are, there's a Delaware Nation in Oklahoma and a Delaware tribe that has locations in both Oklahoma and Kansas. And by the way, those groups still have been back to visit the Abbott marshlands and walk the ground and look at what's happening today. So there are people that live right nearby in New Jersey, and there are people that live as far away as Oklahoma, and they still all have a connection to the land.
Well, that's a big story too. I mean, once you have a museum, you can have exhibits on all kinds of things, and that would be really interesting.
Mm-hmm.
June, did you have a question before? I thought you might have had a hand raised, and I'm not sure I caught it.
Oh, I asked the question already. Thanks.
Okay.
Michael Rockland has a hand up though, Kip.
I'm sorry, what was that, John?
Michael Rockland has a hand up.
Michael, wherever you are, I don't see you on the screen, but go
I'm
ahead and
sorry,
ask your
I'm right
question.
next
There
to-
you are, I see you.
Okay, thank you. And thank you for the work you all do. Something I'm just curious about. Why is the organization called today DNR Greenway? DNR to me suggests the Delaware and Raritan Canal. And have you simply was that your original vision and you expanded it? I just don't understand. The canal is something I'm very interested in, and that's why I'm asking the question.
That's a great question. Thank you. So when DNR started, we were the Delaware and Raritan Greenway. And we were the Delaware and Raritan Greenway starting in 1989 because our focus was to preserve land along the canal itself and the tributaries that ran into it. Over time, we kind of stepped back and looked at some of the ecological values in the area, and we first expanded across the Sauerland Mountain region, and then expanded further in central New Jersey, partly because communities were reaching out to us for help in how to protect land in their communities, and partly because of the ecological connections. And so at one point in time, which must be 15 years ago now, we changed our name from Delaware and Raritan Greenway to just using the initials DNR, Greenway Land Trust. We, at the time, went through a strategic process and wanted to keep the DNR as part of our original name because that was still an important part of our mission. And we added land trust to let people know that we are about caring for land, preserving and caring for land. So that's how we got to DNR Greenway Land Trust. And we also were often confused with the Delaware and Raritan Canal Park or Commission. And I think we still get confused from time to time. But thanks for asking that question. I've got some trustees that are on this Zoom, so I'm glad they're hearing that too. But that's the explanation behind DNR Greenway Land Trust.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Well, thank you all very much. This has been a really tremendous and really interesting discussion. There are some links in the chat for further research and learning. And thank you very much to Pat, and thank you very much to Linda for a terrific presentation, a real eye opener. And thank you all for coming.